Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the seminar. Today's speaker is Phil Dustin. Dr. Dustin did his bachelor's degree at Adelphi. I hope I said that right. And he also did his PhD at Stony Brook and also did work at Scripps before starting his career here at the College of Charleston. Today he's going to talk to us about coral reefs and the tourism pandemic. And I really look forward to Phil's talks. He always has really interesting talks. So I'm going to share my screen with Phil so he can put his stuff up.
Yeah. So before we get started, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'd like to thank you for coming and your interest in my work or the subject, or maybe you just needed something to do in these strange COVID days. What I want to do first is I want to share something with you about what it's like to be on a reef, because I'm going to be talking about coral reefs, but it's they're really special. And when you dive on a reef, I mean, those of us that are privileged enough to do it, we see this just a cacophony of life. I don't know what else to call it, a profusion of life, Cousteau used to say. And, you know, it's this really complex civilization that we go through with all the fish and all the corals and the soft corals and the hard corals and the invertebrates, and it's sort of mind-blowing. And you never really know what you're going to see when you pop into something like this. Every single dive is unique. And in some places, it's just like going into the hood. Everyone's hanging out, and big fish, little fish. You know, the old adage, big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and so on infinitum. And that's what it's like here. And you see these things like these giant sweet lips that swim by, probably at 30 or 40 kilos apiece. Big soft corals. And the difference between this and a forest is it's all alive. And sometimes it's a little bit like sort of Alice in Wonderland. You drop into the sea like a rabbit hole, and you come across strange things that you've never seen before. You almost want to go up to this turtle and say, you know, like, look at you and go, who are you? Like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland or something like that. So it's a special place. All right. Now I'm going to have to stop my screen. I'm going to have to start my screen sharing again. And here we go. All right, I'm going to double check. Does everybody see that? Christine?
Yes, I can see it. I can see it.
Okay, great. So when we begin to talk about reefs, we first think about the globe. And I often think of this photograph, which is probably the most widely circulated photograph ever taken of our planet. And this is affectionately called the blue marble. And if you were some intergalactic trader, you might go to Mars to collect some dust, and you might go to Saturn to collect some tritium gas, but you would come to Earth to collect species. And that's the great treasure of Earth, of the species. This image that Gene Feldman put together showing the distribution of life on Earth from the standpoint of biomass. And you can clearly see the tropics as being outlined in green, Central America and Africa and Southeast Asia. And when you begin to ask, where do we find global biodiversity the highest? In fact, it is in the tropical region of our world, the tropical biomes. Principally on land, we have the Amazon rainforest, we have the Congo, and we have Southeast Asia. And the reasons for these have been highly debated. There's a nice time stability hypothesis that Howie Sanders and Larry Slobodkin worked out, which talks about physically versus biologically controlled environments that on a really large zoomed out scale makes some sense, in that these high diversity environments are old. There's always been a tropics. They're benign. It's a nice place to live. And they're predictable. They'll pretty much be a tropics tomorrow as well. And if we think about where coral reefs are, they're focused within the tropics. It does wander a little bit in terms of seawater temperature, about plus or minus 15 degrees Celsius. But for the most part, equatorial tropics is where we're going to find reefs. And you'll notice in this map, the very center bullseye is Indonesia and the Solomon Islands and the Philippines. And that's a section of the world we call the Coral Triangle. It has the greatest diversity. Now, you might want to say, well, wait a second, aren't rainforests more diverse than coral reefs? Well, rainforests have more species, that's true. They have more insects. They probably have more birds. They have more plants. So they have, in general, more species. But if we dig a little deeper and we say, what about the overall different kinds of animals and plants? We find that reefs way outclass rainforests. 30 of 34 known recognized animal phyla are there. There's 30 to 60,000 species, undescribed species of plants, 4,000 species of fish, 1,400 species of corals, and it goes on and on and on. So reefs are the oldest. They also are the most productive, diverse ecosystems on the planet. The other complex ecosystem we have developing on the planet are humans. And I love this Earth at Night photograph that really shows how we burn energy into the cosmos. And along with lots of people, we're building lots of cities. The world's population has gone from about a little less than 1 billion around the founding of this country to now we're pushing 8 billion or 7 billion. And the little arrows show you my time as a coral reef scientist. So I have been working in this area since about 1970, 1969, 1970, and we've seen, quite a large increase in human population during that time. Enough said. This was modeled by the Club of Rome, in which they showed a population peaking sometime around the middle of this century, and with it, the industrial output dropping because of a decrease in resources and a rise in pollution. They also predicted that there would be a decrease in food availability as well. So we are right near the max of what the Club of Rome predicted. And in fact, all of this is coming true. Bigger storms, more pollution, the ozone hole, global warming, ocean acidification. I mean, and it all goes back to pointing to humans. Now, another thing that's developed in the last 30, 40 years is coral reefs as tourist meccas. And in an Atlas of Ocean Wealth that the Nature Conservancy published about a year ago or 2 years ago, they showed that reefs are worth about 36 billion US dollars per year. They're actually, in some places, it's thought that this could be 10 times that, depending on how you want to calculate worth. And along with this, we've seen an increase in coral monitoring projects starting in 1972 and 1974. And those projects have taken place and they've increased as coral cover around the world has decreased, especially in the Caribbean. In 1997, Loretta Burke and her associates at World Resource Institute published this GIS map of reefs at risk, in which they showed that coral reefs near centers of population were at greatest risk. And the blue dots out in the middle of the ocean they were pretty much okay, except for that red dot right in the center of the Pacific, that's Hawaii. And this was 1997. In 1998, we had a very, very bad deep El Nino, and about 90% of the corals in the Indian Ocean bleached and died. So the word was out, they're no longer necessarily safe just because they're out in the middle of the ocean. And I want to give you an idea of what this collapse in many respects of what these stressors look like. So this is a reef I started my work on in Florida in 1975. And by 2014, it was just rubble bioeroding away. I worked in Bali, I still do. I have this reef called Symphony Reef. That's one of the most beautiful reefs I've ever dove on. totally alive. It got its name because when we first found it, one of my colleagues said, you know, Phil, it was really playing a symphony down there. So we named it Symphony Reef. 3 years later, it was shards and rubble and dead. Dancing Lady Reef in Jamaica, on the north coast of Discovery Bay. This is where modern coral reef biology was basically invented by Tom Goro and his colleagues at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab. 1972, the reef looked like this. You keep your eye on that big coral protruding out. In 2013, that coral was still here. It was dead, but this is what the reef looked like. So having watched this for a good part of 50 years, you get the feeling you're walking through a war zone. And there actually have been some interesting articles written about those of us that study reefs suffering a sort of PTSD about it. And it's sort of like a burned out cathedral as well. These beautiful holy places that are just disappearing. So we're left with this awful thought, you know, can we imagine the world without coral reefs? And there are people that are actually writing that. Now, I want to get across to you that the very adaptations that enable coral reefs to thrive make them vulnerable to humans. And this is something that really has not been acknowledged by the conservation industry yet. So when people first saw reefs, when, you know, I guess you'd say high latitude scientists first went to tropical environments and saw reefs, they were amazed at the life they found in these places where you could see for 200 feet underwater. There were almost no nutrients and sediments in the water. It was summer all the time, so they thought, so high sunlight, and they couldn't quite figure out how you got this incredible community in this nutrient poor desert. Well, it turns out there's very high rates of herbivory, very high filtration rates. But most important, there's this phenomenon we call symbiosis, where organisms actually have co-evolved to live together and to work together. And think about a reef as an underwater mountain that grows, and coral skeletons provide the framework. So this is a slice through Key Largo, limestone in Key Largo. It's about 120,000 years old. So 120,000 years ago, sea level was about 20 feet above the top of this base. So here we have one coral that's about 800 years old. We know that has grown up, and it provides then the framework for the reef. When we look at corals themselves, they're colonial. And they, being colonial, we have many, many polyps, and each polyp has a mouth. And so a reef has been called a wall of mouths in terms of carnivory. In the daytime, these corals fold up. They expose their zooxanthellae, their algal symbionts, to the sun, and they become plants. And we have this really lovely symbiosis we call polytrophy. We have an animal that's catching food in terms of zooplankton, so that's nitrogen and phosphorus. The algae are using the waste products of photosynthesize. They leak plant products back to the animal, high energy acetates and things like that to the animal to help it survive. And they also contribute to the enhancement of calcification through photosynthesis. So we have this really interesting polytrophy. We have animals and plants as one. And all of that takes place on the surface of the coral. 3 cell layers thick sometimes, maybe 4, but no thicker than a piece of paper or maybe on the outside a credit card. So the first thing you have to realize is the surface of the animal is vulnerable to physical pressure or to being smothered. If you or I were to get cut, our body would heal from inside. But if a coral gets cut, it has no place to heal. It has to heal back across that area that's been damaged. The coral symbiosis sets up an internal recycling between the zooxanthellae. And in doing so, the zooxanthellae actually absorb a lot of metabolic CO2, which mediated by carbonic anhydrase seems to help drive the deposition of calcium carbonate as a skeleton. And this is what allowed corals to outcompete sponges about 250 million years ago as the principal reef building organisms on the reef. The forest nutrient cycling that Likens and Borman first described, called the intrasystem cycle, is very much like what's happening internally in a zooxanthellae. And their work in the Hubbard Brook forest, and actually it's more acute in Amazonian forests like this one, but really showed how these ecosystems evolve very tight nutrients recycling. They trap and retain nutrients. And, we as scientists call this biogeochemistry, the interaction between the dead part of the world, the geology, and the living part of the world, the biology. Biogeochemistry is what makes this Earth different from all the other planets we know of. So it's a little primer. High-grade energy goes into this system. That energy is converted by photosynthesis into useful energy. That energy essentially blows out the other side as heat or chemical energy or some kinetic energy. And the profits of that sort of filter up through the food web. Now, over time, an ecosystem will expand to fill the space it can. We call this succession. So if we just looked at a plot of biomass versus time, we would see it increasing and then it asymptotes in late succession when the area gets full or it gets limited by some availability of nutrient or something else. But virtually any community will run through some sort of successional transitions. And when that does, if we plot respiration and photosynthesis, we see that respiration really follows biomass, tracks biomass pretty well. But usually in early or mid succession, there tends to be an increase in gross primary productivity. And the difference between respiration and gross primary productivity, of course, is net. So what happens is, as a system matures, the amount of net primary productivity decreases. In other words, the extractable, harvestable productivity of these systems gets lower and lower and lower. And this is pretty much universal. It's classic work by Eugene Odom showing that if you line up all the ecosystems in the planet, pretty much they fall on a line and they're just a little bit above this P to R equals 1. So most systems are autotrophic, but at the same time, they don't have vast amounts of productivity to give away. They use everything. It's typical. Life expands where it can, the food web fills in, and we may have a higher or lower producing system based on climatology or nutrient availability or whatever. But you notice reefs are right up at the top and they're living in veritable deserts. And that's because the biology traps and retains and recycles the nutrients, and they have tons and tons of energy coming from the sun being in tropical water. So if we think about these systems at steady state or out there in their sort of quote climax condition, and we can argue about that later, but these systems are very close or at their carrying capacity. The inputs and outputs are sort of balanced. The whole system is superimposed on the energy moving through the system. And that brings to mind this idea of homeostasis. These old systems will persist. They have certain resistance, resilience, etc. When we get into the real complex ones, we find out that many of them are what we think of as biologically controlled. Again, living in these environments that are old, benign, and predictable, the biological functions begin to predominate in terms of determinants of biodiversity. So we see competition, predation, density dependence, and we're sort of in the Red Queen hypothesis of running as fast as you can just to stay in place. As a matter of fact, we call it the biological arms race. And here we have these marvelous corals, most of them in the genus Acropora or Acropora if you're British, but they are competing for space, eating and overgrowing one another in slow motion and building this coral reef. And this is just one example of the kind of intricacies and the intimate biological interactions going on these reefs. And the conclusion of all of that is a reef is an ecosystem, not a resource. And this is something that has not gotten into most people's heads or even consciousness, but virtually all the parts of the reef are needed for sustainability. Imagine you go to a tropical rainforest and you say, look at all these beautiful big trees. We could cut them down and make guitars and violin bows and furniture and houses and boats. Let's do it because there's so much of it here. But it might take 100 years to grow a new tree. So you might be able to selectively forest once in a while without significantly changing that system. But really, all of those parts are needed for that system to be sustainable. The same thing goes with a reef. So now I want to shift a little bit and talk about what humans do. And humans do three things. They take stuff, they break stuff, and they pollute. You got a fisherman that's taking stuff out of the sea with gill nets. This is much like random kidnapping. Go into the neighborhood you grew up in and just start randomly kidnapping people. That's sort of what fishing is. The bullies go first. The sharks are the ones that get caught first because they're the bullies. They'll eat anything. And then the next are the carnivores. And then gradually you end up with nets to catch the herbivores. But it's sort of like mass scale kidnapping off a reef. We glean. This lady was selling stuff that had been gleaned off the reef, all the different kinds of mollusk shells. They visit reefs. This is the Miami Geological Society visiting a coral reef for the first time. And we have hordes of scuba divers and hordes of scuba divers. And my friend who owned this establishment in the 1980s, Joe Clark and I were sitting there talking about something, and all the people came and got on the boats and got off the boats. And I said, gee, Joe, look at all those people. He says, those aren't people, Phil, those are dollars. And the growth of scuba diving has been just incredible, especially in the last 20 years. Okay, these are just the number of certificates, entry and continuing level education certificates that PADI issues. And you're looking at close to 1 million certificates a year, rising out of the 1970s. Looks like one of those curves showing the increase in coral reef monitoring projects. And so we have divers, we have people that go sailing, and sometimes they sail onto the reefs and they destroy them. It's like driving a bulldozer through a forest. And then we have people that like to live near the reefs. And in the Florida Keys in the 70s, it was vogue to buy a patch of mangrove swamp, to dragline it, build these long straight canals, use the draglined rock to fill where the mangrove had been, and then plant houses on it. And every house had a septic tank. And every septic tank reaped nutrients into the system, and it fueled the growth of algae. So we had this beginning of algae beginning to take over reefs as opposed to corals being there. And then we saw the advent of coral diseases in which microbial communities of some sort would attack the coral. And we know that one of these is Serratia marcescens, which happens to be a very common prokaryote in the human gut. And it's the Serratia marcescens that kills corals in the Florida Keys is identical to the Serratia marcescens captured at the Key West sewage treatment plant. And then we have other diseases like black band disease on Carysfort Reef. This was a disease that popped up in the mid-70s, first in Bermuda and then in Florida. And this is a consortium of cyanophytes. It can be 1 species or 10 species, and it overgrows the coral as a black band, sort of metabolizing the coral tissue as substrate, leaving behind rock that can be settled by various kinds of corals. And then we burn carbon, like this coal-fired power plant in Washington, D.C. And everything we put in the ocean, down the rivers, gets to the mouths of these rivers, and at the mouth of each river, there happens to be a coastal hypoxic dead zone. And what we put in the river goes around in the ocean currents, and really the whole ocean is connected if you give it enough time. So you can't get away from it. Oh, and then there's plastic, massive amounts of plastic. It was just an interesting thing that the Sierra Club is passing around. I know it might be a new paper where in Indonesia, they're finding plastic particles in large numbers of the seafood that's captured and caught for human consumption. And off the coast of America, they find a lot of fibers, and fibers originate from washing machines, basically, with synthetic fabrics. So we're seeing plastics actually get into the food that we eat. And then there's marine debris, like this compilation of nets, this big, giant, massive nets that we took off a reef in Bali. And then there's coastal development, which causes runoff, because when we break the intrasystem cycle in a forest, we get this massive sedimentation that kills reefs. And then we have the increase in the heat content of the oceans. And as hot as our land is getting, and as much as we might mope about how hot it is now, the oceans have absorbed about 93% of the excess energy coming in. And that's what's driving our hurricanes, and that's what's driving coral bleaching. And coral bleaching occurs when it gets so hot that the zooxanthellae in the corals sort of over photosynthesize and they become toxic, like hot coals. And the coral kicks them out, says, hey, you're dangerous. We've got to dissolve this relationship if I'm going to live. Some animals, like the soft corals that rely on their zooxanthellae, just slowly starve to death when they bleach until they're gone. So what we're seeing is the threats. The human threats are global, regional, local. They're simultaneous, they're synergistic, and they have catastrophic results. And worldwide, we see these symptoms. We see coral diseases, we see excess algae, we see excess sediments. In the Pacific, we're finding crown of thorns infestations. We find physical damage, we find bleaching, and we find lionfish throughout the Caribbean. Human introduction. So we can set together a little model that would sort of try to help us understand how humans affect reefs through deforestation or overfishing or physical destruction or sewage. So it's not like we don't know what these impacts are doing. In the mid-90s, Tunde Agardi had been doing a lot of work on marine protected areas. And she published a really famous book called Marine Protected Areas and Ocean Conservation, and then another one on ocean zoning. And MPAs became the rage, and they became the rage of protecting reefs. And the idea is if you take an area of reef and you don't fish on it and you leave it alone, that no-take allows the fish to restore into that area. And also the fishermen could fish around the edges and collect the spillover. It also began an idea of ecotourism. We have these beautiful reefs that we have protected, and now we're going to let people come and see them. And it's that old thing, don't take anything, just take photographs, right? And so the idea was these marine protected areas would prevent fishing, it would help build a resiliency, and they would prevent the destruction of reefs. So now I want to take you to one of these marine protected areas that is a very, very special place now. And hopefully you'll understand why more as we go along. Raja Ampat is this idyllic set of islands. Raja Ampat means 4 kings. There are 4 islands off the coast of West Papua, the island of Papua New Guinea. And it is idyllic. You go there and it just is beautiful. There are small villages backed up near these old mountains. It's sort of volcanic as well as being coral. There are a bunch of Seventh-day Adventists that have been there and helped the people sort of live in villages and have helped increase their standards of living over time. There are beautiful resorts that just look like idyllic places you want to go and hang out for the rest of your life. And this area in the Bird's Head Seascape is the highest priority on the planet for coral reef conservation, but also for all conservation. This happens to be the atom heart mother of biodiversity on the planet. And so, interestingly enough, it's still almost intact. So it sits in this unique position. It's north of Australia, it's south of Asia, it's just on the tip of this island of sort of Papua New Guinea and West Papua. And it's such a special place for a couple of reasons. One, the overall ocean conveyor belt circulation pattern brings pristine Pacific, South Pacific ocean water right through what's called the Indonesian through flow. And so through the Straits of Dampier and the Straits of Makassar come svedrips of water coming through here. It's like, multi-Gulf streams pushing through here every day. So we're always getting bathed in water. And as you'll see, that causes a really interesting temperature variability too, because the tides are relatively strong, the currents are strong, there's constant upwelling and swirling and mixing of water from deep into shallow. The other aspect is that this area is an equatorial refugia from cyclones. Cyclones don't form in the intertropical convergence zone. They form at the edges, but not right in the heart of it. And this is smack on the equator. So this is obviously a no-brainer place to put a bunch of marine protected areas. And starting in the 1990s, the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife, and Conservation International got together, did a whole bunch of surveys in this area. They spent, in the last 20 years, they've spent over $100 million in conservation of this area. And they established the Bird's Head Marine Protected Areas. And they established some very good rules about that. And they decided that some areas would be possibly areas for ecotourism and other areas would be more or less left alone. And all of these marine protected areas were established. Now, here's a temperature tracing of a year's worth of temperature. So you can see that the top is 31 degrees, the bottom is 27 degrees. We're dealing with a shift from maybe 30 degrees down to 28 degrees, so 2 degrees Celsius. But if you see the monthly and sometimes even the daily temperature range can be as much as almost the annual temperature range. And so it's thought that the corals that live here, all of these animals are sort of temperature generalists with respect to living in the tropics. So one of the things that was done by CI was to try to figure out how much this area is worth. And they showed that the green industries, sort of the stuff that is renewable, was worth way more than the extractive activities of mining and logging. And there's an awful lot of gold and rare minerals in West Papua. But they persuaded everyone and said, look, you guys, if we just concentrate on these, quote, green industries, we can actually make a lot more money and it can be sustainable. And then they did some work on the value of ecotourism. And they showed that it was about 126 billion rupiah a year. And that would be worth about 1.2 trillion rupiah in 20 years. So again, the goods and services of the ecosystem that are sustainable are worth about 5 times or more of the direct value. And the other thing happens, if you look at this, on the right side, there's a reef recovering from fish bombing, and on the left side, an undamaged reef. So if it's worth more money to keep the reef undamaged, by all means, let's keep the reef undamaged. So everybody traded their fish bombing techniques for little eco huts, and they built homestays. And the conservation set up the blue Abadi plan, in which a large number of international NGO personnel came into the area. They flowed into the area, and they trained the local people how to manage a marine protected area. And then they started a phase out in about 2014. They said, basically, you guys are done. And after 2017, it's locally managed with just a few experts that come and go. But for the most part, it's now in local hands. So I first went there on my first trip in 2017 on a friend's 34-foot Warm catamaran, 38-foot Warm catamaran, Jumpalagi, which means see you later in Bahasa. We sailed across the Straits of Dampier. We got stuck in a bad storm. We had to come back. We went the next day. It was a really interesting trip, and it was well worth going there. For someone who has been watching reefs die, it was like, finally, oh, finally. And my pulse dropped. It was just incredible. You know, it was like, okay, we finally found a place that's left. Most people come to see the fish. Sweet lips are sort of the preferred fish to photograph there. Apparently they occur in these little schools and they're bright colored. But when you go and you look at the corals, they're intact and they're everywhere. And they're just this profusion of life that has been sort of stamped out most parts of the world. Big corals, 4 or 5 feet across sometimes, huge corals that are hundreds of years old, big adult corals. And you even find things like woebegone sharks sleeping in these giant corals. You know, it's just amazing. But you also find diver damage, find crown of thorns starfish in plagues now. We find white plague disease. We find on the big corals, these corals that are very old. We find macroalgae overgrowing corals in great profusion. And we find blue-green cyanophytes overgrowing corals in profusion as well. Probably Lingbias here. And it turns out that most people that go to these areas go to see the reefs. the economic value is in the reefs. It's not necessarily in the hotels. So the vast number of people that go here go to visit the dive sites. Those are the things that are worth money. And this area where the arrow ends is where I'm going to talk about now. These are the dive sites along Mansoir and Cree in the Straits of Dampier between Mansoir and Gam, and that distance is about maybe 4 miles, something like that. And when you think about people coming into these areas, they're bundled into what I call lodging units. They can stay in homestays, they can stay in resorts that might have 30 or 40 people, and they can stay on liveaboards. So we get these stationary points, homestays, resorts, villages, and we get mobile yachts and liveaboards. And these are tourists on vacation. So they want to come and they this is a bucket list diving experience. This has been blathered about in all the dive magazines as the ultimate dive trip. So first of all, they want to be safe and modern and nice diving. They want good dive guides. They want comfortable lodging. They want to drink. They want really good food, especially seafood. They want luxurious services, and they want internet, cell phone. So all of this requires a significant amount of infrastructure to make it work. And it generates a significant amount of human waste, both in terms of human and operational. This is localized pollution. In 2019, in that local area, this is basically what we found. 15 plus resorts, 100 plus homestays, north of 150 liveaboards, about 80 yachts a year coming through, local boats, fishing boats, and in 2014, there were 15,000 tourists. Right now, we think there may be as many as 40,000 tourists a year to this place. And this is what happened. So if you superimpress the Blue Abadi program on the increase in tourism, what you see is around 2014, we have the experts leaving, having trained all the locals in charge, and now all of a sudden we have this rocketing out of control population that nobody in their wildest imagination ever expected would happen, but was predicted by the economic forecasts. And with that comes the unintended consequences of all these people that just want to come and see the reef, or maybe a bird of paradise. By the way, this is the land where Wallace, there's a hut where Wallace stayed on Gam and studied the bird of paradise. So you think in terms of what this means. We build this infosystem, this infrastructure for tourists. We deforest the land, we have runoff, we have sewage, chemical pollutants, overfishing, everything. So you go back to this little diagram and you go, holy moly, how are we going to begin to deal with this? In industrial ecology, they do what's called flow path analysis, where they look at the economy and they look at imports and exports. It's very much like biogeochemistry, but it studies what people do. And I want to give you one little example of this. This is just a back of the envelope calculate in terms of human waste poop day estimates. So we're going to imagine that we have people and everybody who's there has a waste load of a poop day. And in 2000, that worked out to about 9.7 million poop days a year. And in 2018, it worked out to about 26 million poop days a year, over 300% increase. And these are very conservative numbers. So we have this massive amount of nutrients being dumped into an ocean. And the reefs become nutrient sinks. Because they are nutrient limited, they will scavenge every single molecule of nitrate or phosphate they can, and they will do so. And it's been shown that essentially nitrogen is like crack cocaine for the zooxanthellae that live in corals. So I started trying to think about how are we going to partition this out so we could begin to work on it. And I thought, G. Evelyn Hutchinson talked about environmental degradation as being nibbled to death by ducks. So everybody that goes there is a duck, but the ducks are not equal. A local will be a smaller duck than a diver. And an underwater photographer will be a bigger duck than the average diver because they break stuff. And a scientist will be, be more than a local, but maybe hopefully less than the average diver because we're a little more careful, but we also sample, so you don't know. But if you just look on a general, these take, break, and pollute areas, this is what we're dealing with. So I started thinking, if we took the logistic equation and started subtracting, much like we do with competition equations and all these other things, we just started subtracting the sum of all the human inputs to this, we could begin to maybe get a handle on some of it from the standpoint of humans. And so I invented this idea of the net impact sum, I, which is just equal to the sum over all groups of the take, break, and pollute impact over all human types. And if we think about that, what that's going to do is it's going to subtract from the logistic equation. Essentially what it's going to do, and it could be either additive or it could be multiplicative. It depends about how you want to set this up. And there may be a more complex way of doing it, but in its simplest idea, what it's doing is it's lowering the carrying capacity of the reef. And so I started thinking about this and said, okay, if that's the case, what do we need to do? So it's clear that the priority needs are to deal with human impacts. We need wastewater gardens for sewage. We need holding tanks in the liveaboards. We need to stop bringing pollutants into the area. We need to compost food. And overall, we have to set a system where we maintain the ecological integrity, because the reef is not a resource. The reef is an ecosystem, and we have to abide by that. For example, a wastewater garden will absorb the nutrients before they get into the ocean. Right now, everybody's using shallow septic in sand. The nutrients just wash into the sea. So we set up this idea of trying to understand coral reef degradation in this area as a pandemic, where we want to track the flow of people, liveaboards, resorts, small dive boats, waste that's produced. And we look at the reef as the recipient of that stress. So it's not something we can manage. It's something that we just have to decrease the stress going to, because the reef will manage itself. This whole thing about we're going to go out and resource manage on a reef is really a bunch of malarkey. Okay, reefs will do fine if we leave them alone, as long as we eliminate the stressors that are global, local, global, regional, and local. So we can track the condition of the reef in terms of temperature change, remote sensing of change, underwater soundscapes, underwater surveys. We set up this idea of a decision support system that will bring information into a GIS system, an international GIS system that interfaces with a local system. And we look at essentially reef health and human threat assessments and come out with some sort of idea of what the carrying capacity could be. And this has a direct line to government industries, as well as all the various associations that work there and the people that own the resorts, as well as nonprofits. So the idea is to try to begin to manage the impacts of people, okay? So we go back to this idea of sustainability that people call the balance of nature, and it's a big green buzzword, and in many respects it means surviving, okay? But if you think back to a real ecosystem, these inputs are approximately constant, and they're superimposed upon the energy that's flowing through the system. And these ecosystems must obey, like Andre the Giant, they must obey the laws of nature. So we need to integrate people into this natural system with as light a footprint as possible, and realize that this could support flourishing communities, but it's going to support them over large profits that are exportable. We have to realize that everything has to go back into the system. And the resort that I work with has a nonprofit, and Max has the finest resort in all of Raja Ampat, and he puts 75 to 85% of his profits back into the community. For example, he buys all the fish that the fishermen catch if they're pelagic fish. He will not buy reef fish. He helps build schools. He pays the salaries of school teachers. He's recently built a catamaran boat that is far more fuel efficient. It's become the supply boat for Raja Ampat during the pandemic. And we're working on sort of a design of the ultimate wastewater garden that could be transported and essentially put everywhere. So we're trying to work this out with the idea though, so we flipped it. It's like flipping your classroom. What we've done is instead of trying to manage the reef, we're trying to figure out how to manage the people the way you would a pandemic. So thanks for Zooming with us today. I hope this is well received. We got some time left. I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys might have and push us a little further down the road. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. Does
You're
anybody
welcome.
have questions? Eric?
Hey, Phil, that was really interesting. I love the photos from that part of the world. So it seems like there's a really strong debate out there right now. I want some sense of your side of it, that MPAs are really effective at dealing with local and regional stressors. But what we've seen is that even the best and most protected MPAs are no match for a warming ocean, a more acidic ocean. There are the others that say that they're allowing these reefs to be more resilient. So I guess I'm wondering, where on that spectrum do you lie, and where should we put our resources? Because it really is a zero-sum game in terms of where we put conservation dollars.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, on Raja Ampat, they've spent $100 million and they've created something now that's out of control. And that money is basically, I say, why don't you just buy it and pay the people to live there and keep it away from tourism. And there are people buying that. I think you've got a really good point in that the global climatology that we see now with carbon is going to be destructive. We do know, for example, that excess nutrients enables those zooxanthellae to grow faster. And when they do that, they run out of phosphate. So if they have excess nitrogen, they grow faster and they scavenge sulfates to make their membranes out of rather than phosphates. And that makes them about 50% more susceptible to temperature. So if you saw Chasing Coral, that whole bleaching episode on the barrier reef was about 50% or more worse than it could have been if it wasn't for the nutrification. So there is a synergy going on. Raja Ampat seems to be situated in this special sweet spot. And so it's my feeling that if there's one place worth fighting for, this is the place. And that's not to say it's not going to disappear in time, but my feeling is, you know, this place has the best place. That said, it's an incredibly fragile ecosystem. And hopefully if people come there, if the education is correct, we will begin to get off carbon soon. And I would highly recommend Kim Stanley Robinson's new book called The Ministry for the Future, which deals with all these issues in a big way and begins to engage humanity. And one of the sayings that, you know, especially coming up to this election, is all politics are local. And in reality, all ecology is local too. It just depends where you are. But you have to get across that the person in Minnesota, you know, burning a lot of electricity and driving around in an SUV is also responsible for what's happening on reefs. So in a local way, it's that. So we really have to transition off carbon. We do have the doom and gloom that reefs are going to die. And believe me, you know, the Florida Keys are down to 2% of what was there. Bali, we saw a 50% death, 44% death of corals in the last bleaching episode. So as these episodes come stronger and stronger, we're going to have problems. But I think we have to put our money in both baskets. For humanity and for the planet, carbon is the #1 thing we have to deal with. But at the same time, if we can limit the stress in the local areas, we can maybe give that area a better chance of surviving into the future. Hope that answered your question.
Phil, I have a question.
Sure.
One of the papers that we've been reading in genomics talks about the genomes of the coral reefs. It was a comparative genomics paper. And at the end of the paper, they suggested that coral reefs might be resilient to global warming. What are your feelings about that? Have you seen any evidence of that? Or what do you think the long-term?
Well, you know, we're going to, we have reefs and we have corals. And as long as we have corals, we'll live, okay? Reefs have been through catastrophic changes. You know, the reefs, the modern reefs today have been through mass extinctions. Some of them more recent than not. I think there'll always be little bits and pieces of corals left in places and they can recolonize. You got to think reefs are the oldest systems of animals that we know of, except maybe thermal vent communities. But in shallow waters, reefs are the max, and they have very, very complex population genetics. And I would imagine that, as has been said, you know, reefs are very simple on the outside, but very sophisticated on the inside. So they have the population genetics of survivors through deep time. So reefs are going to be around a lot longer than humans. You know, it'd only take a couple hundred years for the atmosphere to cleanse itself of carbon dioxide if humans were to vanish. If we have a couple of heat waves, like Robinson describes, like we've already had in Paris, for example, a couple of years ago when, you know, 10,000 people died. We have these big heat waves, we start wiping out parts of the population, and famines and you name it, big storms and stuff. It won't be that long till humans are driven down into small groups in different places. And then the Earth's going to come back. So I'd put my money on corals before I put my money on humans.
Anybody else have a question? You guys can just speak up if you can't raise your hand.
Yeah, just speak up. Nicholas, what's up?
Hey, great talk. That was really interesting. I'm really passionate about coral reefs, and that is via tourism. So I just saw the title of this presentation, and I thought that it would be something really cool to tune into. But I've done a little bit of traveling, and a lot of it is in Latin America, and especially the reefs on the Gulf side of Latin America.
Sure.
And that's where I've done some of my diving. And I don't know, I guess it's not an epiphany, because I feel like people are working on embedding conservation within tourism, especially in the diving community. I was curious what you've seen, you know, I guess worldwide, globally, specifically in Southeast Asia. What role does conservation tourism play in these communities, regardless of like people going in, you know, and donating money towards conserving, but actual physical participation? Do you think that that is an effective way to address like reef conservation, or do you think that it's kind of a waste of time?
Well, you notice Patty is expanding exponentially, and their dive magazine, Alert Diver, is it's a travel log for liveaboards. It's exactly what Skin Diver was in the 1980s. And Stephen Frink, who does Alert Diver, was a photographer with Skin Diver and helped do that commercial model. It's a commercial model of development. Liveaboards flush their ballast tanks, they flush their silage tanks wherever they are, they just flush them. They might move a little bit offshore or not. Tourists take with them all kinds of contaminants in their bodies. For example, we're learning about neonicotinoid compounds that are used as pesticides, and all of us that eat a Western diet are loaded with that stuff. So wherever we go, we take that with us. Conservation tourism is a really great thing if it's done well, but most of the places it's done to maximize profit. In Raja Ampat, they tried to do it differently and said, well, you can have a small homestay. You could have like 2 or 3 little huts and people can come and stay and eat with the family, and that has a very low footprint. But the septic tanks they use are just draining nutrients right into the ocean. And if you have enough of them, you end up with a problem, right? And that's the problem. It's the scale of the whole thing. And ecotourism is a business like anything else. So what we're going to have to do is maybe have lotteries or something. For example, if you go hiking in the high Sierras now in California, you join a lottery to see if you're one of the few hundred people that get to do it. Where is it? In other part on Komodo, if you want to go to Komodo now, they up the price of a ticket to something like $1,000. So that excludes everybody except the uber wealthy. They're saying liveaboard now, to go a week on a liveaboard can be $5,000 or $8,000. So you're talking about very rich people that want very rich food, very rich, you know, they want to have a high lifestyle because they're tourists, as they say in the lionfish. So what you need to do is get the tourists to really become eco-tourists and to have a minimum footprint and to figure out how much of that can be tolerated and to control that. Because if you just open it up to capitalism, That's what's happened to the Florida Keys. That's what's happened to throughout the Bahamas and the Caribbean and every place else. One small example, what is it now? It's the tourist harvest of lobster the week before the commercial lobster fishing opens in the Florida Keys, doubles the flush rate in Key West. So it used to double the amount of sewage going into the ocean. And it brings in probably as much money as the whole commercial lobster fishery. And those people go in the water and they just tear the reef apart to get the lobster. Because after all, they're spending a lot of money, they deserve to get the lobster, right? So somehow I have to change that attitude, that sort of entitlement that tourists think of because they're paying a lot of money for this, they get to do this. And that's done best in very small ways with guides. And you do have to up the price in some respects, but you have to make it something special, not just something open for the masses. And it has an educational value. People go home and talk about it, right? And so you can spread it that way. If you can begin to spread that experience through the local population so people realize what they do at home is important, then I think you're doing something. But yeah, tourism is like a pandemic on reefs right now. It's just gone rampant.
There's another question from James Pickney.
Phil, so I'd be interested in getting your perspective on coral transplanting and replanting methods that are being used, especially in the Keys. There's a huge amount of resources and effort that's going into that. What do you think about that?
Well, I not only transplanting out, but collecting in and keeping corals safe in aquaria. With this new sclerotic disease that's attacking the last 2% of the corals, some of the most resistant species, there have been massive efforts to go out and collect what look like healthy corals and quarantine them in aquaria until they can be put back in the wild again. So we have these two things. Transplanting is fine. In a place like Raja Ampat, I have a friend who is laying out big areas of cyclone fencing to which they attach small frags of corals because they've been bombed. So there the stress was a physical stress that destroyed the reef. If you go to the Florida Keys, where NOAA is about to spend north of $90 million on their fixing, I think it's 5 or 7 iconic reefs. One of them happens to be the reef you saw, Carysfort Reef. They're gonna have big coral gardening episodes. They're gonna plant the corals out there. Here's the deal though. It's sort of like if you went into Sao Paulo to one of the barrios, to a slum, and you got a bunch of kids that were real sick and beat up and had grown up in the slum, and you brought them to the Western world and you fed them up good and you gave them a lot of shots and stuff and you put them back in that barrio, they'd go back to being sick. So unless we go down to the basics and we fix the water quality, all of this is sort of like a whisper in a hurricane. And I know it's the vogue thing, and I know that people want to grow the super corals, and I think that's all well and good, but the money we're putting into that could be far better spent on correcting some of the real issues. Case in point, the sewer system that was constructed for the Florida Keys at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. They treat the sewage in package plants. They pump it they pump the waste 100 feet down. They deal with the BOD, but they don't remove the nutrients. And that water goes straight out to the reef through tidal pumping. So they did a quote fix, but they haven't addressed the issues. And they have to go to fundamentals. If you want to have reefs, you have to have the environmental conditions that will allow reefs to exist in that ecosystem. Otherwise, you might have a few ragged corals down there and say, oh, I transplanted these 20 years ago, or they might just all get wiped out. They're not going to form the wave resistant sort of emergent ecosystem that a reef is, much like a forest. That's my 2 cents on that.
You've got another question from Punit Dandhandia.
Hi.
Hi, Philip. That was a very enlightening talk. Thank you. I'm Punit from Pondicherry in India. And we have a foundation, an NGO called Cuddle Life Foundation, just starting off. I have my colleague Manjula Tiwari, Dr. Manjula Tiwari here also with me. We are working on trying to sort of set up artificial reefs off our coast here. I'd like to ask you, what do you think about artificial reefs and their utility?
You know, they have their place. We've been doing a lot of sinking of ships, and we realize that there's massive iron pollution from ships. If you build a reef, you're building a structure. So if you build an artificial reef, say out of concrete blocks, you know, that have the hollow in the side, you'll get fish that live in that size hole. So if you build an artificial reef, what you need to do is have many different dimensions to it. It needs as much dimensionality as a coral reef could have. And you'll get some species that go there. And there's a general overall increase in species diversity of fish as there's an increase in the structural complexity of the reef. We call that rugosity. But then there's an additional increase because some fish are specialized to certain species of coral. So when you build an artificial reef, if you can build one, you know, if the water quality will allow you to build that, you want to build it as diverse as you possibly can to use that. And, you know, in many cases, you could say, well, gee, I want to catch fish that are, say, you know, I don't know, 24 centimeters long. So what size hole do they live in? And you could build a fishing reef that had most of those holes. And it might all fill up with gray snapper or something like that. And that's happened in the Bahamas with people that have built reefs out of certain materials. But there are reef balls. There's bio-rock. You can use that. You can use reef balls. You can use different sizes of cements. I've seen people use coconut husks. And again, the more dimensionality you can add to it, the better it'll be.
Thank you.
Sure.
If anybody would like to stay after and talk to Phil, Dr. Dustin more about this, feel free to. If you feel like you need to go ahead and go for some reason, you need to get to class or whatever, go ahead and feel free to do that too. If you have a question, you can just say so.
Yeah, just zing it out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I did kind of have an additional question, unless you had a question.
Kitty, hi, good to see you.
Oh, go ahead. I'll ask mine after.
Okay, so I am trying to wrap my head around how resilient, like Christine was saying earlier, about how resilient coral reef systems are, and the question of, you know, the new hot word in environmental science, resilience. But
Yeah.
as you know, the temperature that's increasing globally, especially in, you know, marine ecosystems, it's going to be moving north, kind of similar to our terrestrial ecosystems, right?
Right.
So coral reef systems develop over too long of a period of time to be able to keep up with that that rate of movement, right? This is just kind of a fundamental question.
Maybe not. But there's another wall they hit. We have a project offshore Charleston, about 12 miles offshore, called the Wreck of the Freddie Day, which is a bunch of concrete blocks, bags from a sunk schooner. And there's a species that lives on it that bleaches once in a while. And when the zooxanthellae grow back, they're the same clade. And it turns out that the clade that lives there is cold adapted. Because after monitoring the temperatures for years, we found that not only is it getting hotter, it's also getting colder in the winter because we have bigger storms, and that brings cooler water up. So that the temperature offshore Charleston now in the summer will be in the mid 80s, so it's 82 degrees, 80 degrees. But in the wintertime, it'll get down into the 40s. So reefs are going to be able to move north, and we see this in West Palm. We see some species moving north, but they're going to hit a wall. Okay. The question is, if there are adaptations in the zooxanthellae and the rates of herbivory, I would see you might be able to adjust the ratio of zooxanthellae to coral tissue, and depending upon what's available as food and things like that, I think we'll see that. Reefs have survived times of higher CO2 and times of lower CO2. They've survived warmer times, they've survived colder times. They are 250 million years old. That's the scleractinian corals, and then their lineage goes back before that. So they're here. I don't think that should give us much, pause to feel safe, but I think their genetics is probably the most sophisticated population genetics and built for surviving. They also gone through sea level rise, right? Up and down. So we're talking about the water getting hotter. Well, imagine the water gets hotter and then all of a sudden it goes up and you're no longer in the right light zone. And sea level came up pretty fast. It took, let's see, 17,000 years ago, sea level was roughly 150 meters below what it is today. And then about 5,000 years it stabilized. So you're dealing with less than 10,000 years of this rapid change. And all the reefs you see today are less than 5,000 years old. So, yeah, we're causing something at about probably 3,000 to 10,000 times faster than it would occur naturally. What's up, Kitty?
Well, I was going to ask another question about your opinion back in Indonesia and Raja Ampat. So Raja Ampat and West Papua have built their reputation in Indonesia as being a conservation province. And so they're really banking on continuing this, this perception as a conservation province. But what also goes along with that is as a place for tourists to come and dive. So exactly. How would you go about convincing people to make some of the changes that you've discussed, which might mean lowering their income? Obviously, a lot of people get into tourism and ecotourism as a way to make money and as a way for a livelihood. So how would you approach discussions with people in Raja Ampat to become a little more environmentally friendly towards the reefs?
Yeah. So the first people I met were a bunch of Western expatriates that own businesses. Wick owns in Sarong owns a business that basically services scuba tanks. And then I met Max Armour, who owns Papua Divers. And I've met Andy, what's Andy? Who owns Misul. And these people realize that the future of their businesses are based on the idea of keeping the ecology intact. When I took my slideshow on the road, I went to Conservation International and talked with Lori Katz, who had set up the Blue Abadi program. And she was very hostile at my coming in and saying, there's a problem in Raja Ampat. And she said, I was there for 5 years and never saw more than 1 or 2 crown of thorns. I never saw coral disease. I never saw. And then I showed her the photographs. And now Mark Erdman is starting to move back in. And Mark realizes the problem. So there's this awakening of these sleeping giants that thought they'd done their job. And so I think we're seeing some movement there. The local fisheries people are very much friends of Wicks and Max and Andy Miner, who owns Missoula. And these are the people, and also the guy that started liverboards there. So these people are friends. And Safri, who's head of fisheries, has seen my talk, and he's like, what do? We need to keep Raja Ampat intact. So we have those people on our side. Some of the other people at the universities are also beginning to see these issues. And we're trying to get it up into the main government. And what Max wants to do is sort of build a big phalanx of all these different arguments and get the dive guides involved, the local resorts, everybody involved to say, look, if we do the right technology, we can open this up, but we can't have it continually growing. So we need to go for wastewater gardens. We need to go for wastewater tanks and the liverboards. We need to limit where the liverboards go. There has to be some controls. Originally, when the plan was conceived, there were supposed to be 40 liverboards operating in the area seasonally. And now there's almost 200 because of the gold rush. And the Indonesian government is is actively supporting people to migrate to Sarong from Java because of the overpopulation. So that's going to dilute the politics. The big issue is that I think the people that have the big businesses and the local government and the big nonprofits have to go to the government and say, you're going to kill the goose that lays a golden egg unless you deal with this. And what we're trying to do, the project we've put together is hopefully with NASA to create a decision support system, working with a local nonprofit that is very much embedded in the locals. So we're trying to bridge that sort of international with local. And it's interesting when I tell people we wrote a NASA proposal, it's like, oh, you wrote a NASA? Oh, that's incredible, NASA. We don't even have the money yet. We just wrote the proposal, but NASA creates a buzz that hopefully gets people to wake up, you know, and you and I have both seen what happens in Bali and what's going on in Bali now. And you know, again, they want to spend, what, ₹1 billion, I think it is, and plant corals throughout Bali. And that makes some sense, but in other words, you've got to fix up the local places first as well. So the idea of a conservancy provincie is really good. I've talked with the people that got the government involved in that. They spent lots and lots and lots of money. And the hope is we can get across to them that we have to do something like this or the systems are just going to crash. And these systems, like the reef behind me, are all branching corals. They don't grow they grow in lots of current, but they don't grow in lots of wave action. So it's like a bunch of azalea bushes. And if you go in and they start to die, they'll just crumble. And there won't be anything left in a matter of a couple of years if it really takes hold and starts to go through. And there are fields like that right now. There are fields of coral downstream from places like Arborek Island that just dump all their waste into the ocean. So it's happening. The hope is we can get the local government and the provincial government, you know, the province government to then make some decisions. So we hope, and Max and Andy are doing a lot of politics at that level, awful lot of politics at the level of the provincial government. So who knows? Yeah. Anybody else? Michelle, are you connecting? I hear someone.
Brandon is online too. He had joined to talk to you.
Oh, good. Yeah, Brandon, hi.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hey,
Loud and clear.
I'm actually a sophomore attending U of SC, and I just got into marine science. So I'm not like I don't know too much about everything, but I find this really interesting, and I enjoy listening to you speak. And I think your work is amazing. So
Thank you. If you want to get into it, go talk with Jay Pinkney.
Jay Pinkney, okay.
Yeah, Jay was one of my students, and he's at USC right now, and he can help steer you on a path into this whole business.
I gotcha. Well, I appreciate that.
Sure, you bet. Yep.
And Michelle is chatting with us.
Yeah, I see her. So talk to Claudia. Claudia, are you around?
No, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Yes. I apologize for joining so late. I had another meeting that went really, really long. But yeah, so Claudia Benitez Nelson is, she's Associate Dean at UFSC, and she is very active in marine science programs. She's one of the main professors there. But Phil, I actually was at College of Charleston doing my master's when Mitchell Colgan was still chair. And so I remember hearing stories about you and y'all's work that y'all had done in the past. So that was fun.
Yeah. You know, it's been sort of a race around the world watching corals die for years. Yeah. And we finally get to a place where maybe we can actually implement some practices that will help these reefs survive.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thanks for zooming in. It's a new style of meeting. It's kind of fun because we can bring colleagues in from all over the world.
Pretty cool.
Thanks for coming. All right. Stay safe and don't forget to vote. If you're in the US, vote, vote, vote.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
You bet. Take care.
Hey, Christine, would I be able to get a copy of this recording?
Sure. Can you, I'd be happy to send you a
Yeah.
copy. Can you give me your email address?
Yeah, Hardym at mailbox. Because I teach the honors course here at USC, and I gave them this option for watching for extra credit, but a lot of them didn't get that notice until early this morning, so I don't think any of them joined, but I still want to give them that option, but then I also want to watch it myself. So
Okay.
I greatly appreciate if you could do that for me.
Sure. I'll send it to you. Thanks
Okay,
for coming.
and do you need like numbers of who watches it for your own recording or record?
No. It's fun to see how many people come, but
Yeah.
but nobody's recording that information, I don't think.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.